Imagine that everything you believe about free will might not be exactly as you were taught. Jacobus Arminius challenged the dominant view of predestination, and his ideas deeply shaped Christian theology. But why does almost no one talk about it? Who tried to hide his discoveries, and why? If you think your destiny is already sealed, this video might completely change your perspective. Today, we'll dive into the life and teachings of Arminius, exploring his revolutionary ideas about free will and God's grace. We'll expose myths, reveal little-known truths, and understand how this theological debate directly impacts your faith, your choices, and even your future. By watching until the end, you'll gain a much clearer understanding of what it truly means to have free will within the Christian faith, and how it can transform your spiritual journey. So, if you want to discover what they don't want you to know about Jacobus Arminius, stay tuned. Birth and early years. Jacobus Arminius, originally named Jacob Hermanson, was born on October 10, 1560, in the town of Oudwater, located in the Netherlands. His early life was marked by tragedy, as he lost his father while still a child. This loss left his family in a vulnerable situation, making his upbringing more challenging. However, despite these difficulties, Arminius showed early signs of intellectual promise and a keen interest in theological matters. The hardships in his life worsened in 1575 when the Spanish forces, as part of the 80 Years' War, attacked Oudwater. The town was brutally sacked, and during this massacre, Arminius' mother, along with several other family members, was killed. The devastating event left him orphaned, forcing him to rely on the goodwill of others for his survival and future prospects. Despite this tragic beginning, Arminius' life took an unexpected turn when he found support from individuals who recognized his potential. Education. Following the loss of his family, Arminius was taken in by Theodorus Emilius, a dedicated scholar and clergyman who saw promise in the young boy. Emilius ensured that Arminius received an education by enrolling him in a prestigious school in Utrecht. Under the guidance of his benefactor, Arminius thrived academically, developing a strong foundation in classical studies and theology. His natural intellectual curiosity and disciplined approach to learning quickly distinguished him from his peers. His pursuit of higher education led him to the University of Leiden, one of the most respected institutions of learning in the Netherlands at the time. There, he studied under renowned scholars such as Lambertus Denius and Johannes Drusius, who played a significant role in shaping his theological views. At Leiden, Arminius was exposed to a broad range of theological perspectives, which later influenced his stance on issues of predestination and free will. During his time at the university, Arminius developed a deep appreciation for theological inquiry, engaging in rigorous debates and scholarly discussions. He showed particular interest in reconciling doctrinal conflicts within the Reformed tradition, a pursuit that would define his career as a theologian. His growing reputation as a brilliant student earned him the opportunity to further his studies abroad, paving the way for his future contributions to Protestant theology. Despite the tragedies that shaped his early years, Arminius' resilience and dedication to learning propelled him toward a path of theological distinction. His formative years, filled with loss and hardship, played a crucial role in shaping his compassionate and thoughtful approach to doctrinal issues, an approach that would later challenge some of the dominant theological positions of his time. Studies abroad. In 1582, Jacobus Arminius embarked on a significant phase of his education by continuing his theological studies in Geneva, a major center of Reformed thought. Under the mentorship of Theodore de Beze, the esteemed successor of John Calvin, Arminius was exposed to the rigorous teachings of Calvinist doctrine. De Beze was a staunch defender of predestination, a doctrine that would later become a point of contention in Arminius's own theological journey. While studying in Geneva, Arminius displayed remarkable intellectual abilities, engaging in deep theological discussions and refining his understanding of Christian doctrine. Despite his promising academic career, Arminius faced challenges in Geneva. His willingness to question certain aspects of Calvinist thought led to suspicions among some of his peers and mentors. Though he remained respectful of his instructors, his independent thinking occasionally placed him at odds with the rigid orthodoxy of the Jean-Vin Academy. As a result, he eventually sought opportunities elsewhere to broaden his theological perspective. Arminius later moved to Basel, another important hub of theological scholarship, where he continued to deepen his knowledge. His intellectual brilliance and devotion to theology were widely recognized, and in acknowledgement of his scholarly achievements, he was offered the prestigious title of Doctor of Theology. However, in a gesture of humility, Arminius declined the honor, believing that he had not yet reached the level of learning and experience necessary to accept such a distinction. This decision reflected his modest character and his sincere commitment to academic and spiritual growth. Pastoral ministry in Amsterdam. In 1587, Arminius returned to the Dutch Republic and was ordained as a minister in Amsterdam. His arrival came at a crucial time, as theological debates and political tensions were shaping the religious landscape of the Netherlands. Despite these challenges, Arminius quickly gained a reputation as an eloquent preacher and a compassionate pastor. His sermons were characterized by clarity, depth, and a strong emphasis on practical Christian living, making him a beloved figure in the city's Reformed community. Beyond his preaching, Arminius was deeply involved in the pastoral care of his congregation. He provided spiritual guidance to his parishioners, addressed their theological concerns, and engaged in discussions on important doctrinal matters. His dedication to both intellectual rigor and pastoral responsibilities set him apart as a minister who sought to bridge the gap between scholarly theology and everyday Christian life. In 1590, Arminius married Ligsbeth Riel, the daughter of a wealthy and influential Amsterdam merchant and poet. Theological controversy. Originally tasked with refuting the ideas of Dirk Coornhert regarding predestination, Jacobus Arminius found himself increasingly questioning the Calvinist doctrine of absolute predestination. While Coornhert had criticized the rigid determinism of Calvinism, Arminius initially set out to defend it. However, as he examined the scriptures more deeply, he began to see inconsistencies in the idea that God had unconditionally predestined some to salvation and others to damnation. This led him to develop a theological perspective that emphasized human free will and God's prevenient grace, which enables individuals to respond to divine calling. Arminius argued that God's justice and love were better represented by a system in which humans had a genuine choice in their salvation. He contended that God's grace was resistible and that election was conditional upon faith, rather than being an arbitrary decree made before the foundation of the world. This stance placed him in direct opposition to the prevailing Calvinist orthodoxy of his time, which held to the idea of unconditional election and irresistible grace. His evolving views quickly drew criticism from strict Calvinists, who saw them as a dangerous deviation from Reformed theology. Professorship in Leiden. In 1603, Arminius was appointed as a professor of theology at the University of Leiden. His nomination was initially met with approval, as he was regarded as a brilliant theologian and preacher. However, his teachings soon became a source of theological tension, particularly in his debates with his colleague Franciscus Gomarus, a staunch defender of Calvinist predestination. Their disagreements centered on the nature of divine election, grace, and human responsibility in salvation. Gomarus accused Arminius of deviating from the doctrines established by John Calvin and the Synod of Dordrecht. He argued that Arminius's views undermined the sovereignty of God by making human choice a determining factor in salvation. Arminius, on the other hand, maintained that his position was in line with both Scripture and the early Church Fathers. He insisted that God's sovereignty was not compromised by allowing humans to participate in their own salvation through faith, enabled by grace. The theological disputes between Arminius and Gomarus divided not only the faculty at Leiden, but also the broader Dutch Reformed Church. Supporters of Arminius, later known as the Remonstrants, championed his emphasis on conditional election and resistible grace. Opponents, known as the Counter-Remonstrants, remained steadfast in their adherence to the traditional Calvinist interpretation of predestination. This conflict would ultimately lead to the Synod of Dort, 1618 to 1619, where Arminianism was officially condemned, though it continued to grow as a distinct theological movement. Despite the controversy surrounding his teachings, Arminius remained committed to defending his beliefs until his death in 1609. His legacy endured through his followers, who continued to advocate for a more balanced approach to divine sovereignty and human free will. His theological insights would later influence key Protestant movements, including Methodism and the broader evangelical tradition, ensuring that the debate over predestination and free will remained a central issue in Christian theology for centuries to come. Arminianism and the Remonstrants. The theological ideas of Jacobus Arminius laid the foundation for what would later be known as Arminianism, a movement that directly challenged the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional predestination. Unlike Calvinism, which taught that God had predetermined who would be saved and who would be damned, Arminius emphasized that salvation was available to all but required an individual's free acceptance. He argued that God's grace was resistible, meaning that human beings had the ability to respond to or reject divine calling. This belief placed a strong emphasis on human responsibility in the process of salvation. After Arminius' death in 1609, his followers sought to systematize and defend his teachings against the dominant Calvinist theology of the time. In 1610, a group of his disciples, known as the Remonstrants, presented a formal theological statement known as the Remonstrance. This document outlined 5 key points of disagreement with Calvinism, particularly opposing the idea that God's election was absolute and unconditional. Instead, they argued for a conditional election based on God's foreknowledge of human faith. The Remonstrance sparked intense theological debates within the Dutch Reformed Church, leading to a broader conflict between Arminians and Calvinists. Calvinists saw the Remonstrant position as a dangerous deviation from orthodox doctrine, believing it undermined God's sovereignty. The controversy eventually led to the Synod of Dort, 1618 to 1619, a gathering of Reformed theologians who sought to address the disputes caused by Arminian theology. The Synod ultimately condemned the teachings of the Remonstrants and reaffirmed the Calvinist doctrines of predestination and irresistible grace. As a result of the Synod's decision, Arminianism was officially rejected in the Netherlands, and many of its supporters faced persecution. Some were expelled from the Dutch Reformed Church, while others went into exile. Despite this suppression, Arminianism continued to spread, influencing various Christian traditions, including Methodism and other evangelical movements. The emphasis on free will and universal grace resonated with many believers who struggled with the idea of a predetermined destiny. Over time, Arminian theology gained significant traction, particularly through the work of John Wesley in the 18th century. Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was deeply influenced by Arminian ideas and helped popularize them among English-speaking Christians. His teachings on prevenient grace, which asserts that God grants all individuals the ability to seek salvation, became a cornerstone of Methodist doctrine and helped distinguish it from Calvinist traditions. Today, Arminianism remains an influential theological perspective within Christianity. It has shaped numerous Protestant denominations and continues to be a subject of theological debate. The fundamental tension between divine sovereignty and human free will remains a central issue in Christian theology, with Arminianism offering a compelling alternative to Calvinist determinism. Between 1618 and 1619, the Synod of Dort was convened in the city of Dordrecht, in the Netherlands, to address the theological controversy between the followers of Jacobus Arminius and the adherents of John Calvin. The Arminians, led by Arminius, argued for a more flexible understanding of divine grace, free will, and predestination, in contrast to the strict Calvinist views that emphasized unconditional election and predestination. The Synod, made up of a majority of Calvinist theologians and church leaders, met in response to growing divisions within the Reformed churches in the Netherlands and sought to settle the dispute over these theological differences. During the proceedings of the Synod, the Arminian position was thoroughly debated, and ultimately, it was rejected by the majority. The Synod condemned the 5 main points of Arminianism, which were viewed as undermining the core tenets of Calvinist doctrine, particularly regarding the nature of God's sovereignty and the certainty of salvation. In response to the Arminian views, the Synod of Dort formally affirmed the 5 points of Calvinism, often summarized by the acronym TULIP: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. These points became the defining features of Reformed theology, marking a significant moment in the history of Protestantism. The 5 points of Calvinism, solidified at the Synod, set the framework for Reformed churches across Europe, particularly in places like the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Scotland. These doctrines emphasized God's absolute authority and the belief that salvation was solely the result of God's will, independent of human action or merit. For Calvinists, the Synod of Dort was seen as a victory, securing the theological future of their movement and affirming their understanding of grace and salvation. However, despite the condemnation of Arminianism at the Synod of Dort, the ideas of Jacobus Arminius did not fade away. Over time, Arminianism gained significant influence in other branches of Protestantism, particularly in England and the American colonies. Key figures like John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, embraced many of the Arminian views, especially the emphasis on free will and the possibility of resisting or accepting God's grace. This led to the rise of movements that highlighted human agency and salvation, standing in contrast to the more deterministic worldview of Calvinism. Arminianism's influence continued to grow, particularly within evangelicalism, where the focus on personal faith and choice in the process of salvation resonated with many. The emphasis on free will in Arminian theology made it an attractive alternative to the more rigid Calvinist doctrines, appealing to a broader spectrum of Protestants. Despite its rejection at the Synod of Dort, the movement found fertile ground in the hearts of many believers, who found solace in the belief that salvation was not entirely predestined, but rather dependent on individual response to God's grace. In the modern era, the debate between Calvinism and Arminianism remains central to many Protestant denominations. While the Synod of Dort marked a decisive moment in affirming the Reformed position, the ongoing influence of Arminian thought underscores the importance of free will in Christian theology. The Synod of Dort may have rejected Arminianism, but the legacy of Arminius' teachings continues to shape and inspire Protestant thought, particularly in the development of movements like Methodism and evangelicalism. In conclusion, the Synod of Dort played a pivotal role in shaping the theological landscape of Protestantism by affirming the 5 points of Calvinism and rejecting the views of Jacobus Arminius. While it was a decisive moment for Calvinism, the influence of Arminianism persisted and flourished, particularly within movements such as Methodism and evangelicalism. The debate between Calvinism and Arminianism continues to be a significant point of discussion within Protestant circles, highlighting the ongoing tension between divine sovereignty and human free will. Ultimately, the Synod of Dort's legacy is a reminder of the enduring impact that theological disagreements can have on the development of Christian doctrine and the diverse interpretations of salvation within the broader Christian tradition.